Welcome to today's podcast with attorney Jon Whitehead, attorney in Missouri. And we're glad to have him joining us today to talk about legal issues that we have seen not only arising through the SBC23 annual meeting just a few days ago, but also other issues that may be facing the Southern Baptist Convention in the upcoming days, just legal issues related. So let's welcome Jon today. We're glad to have Jon joining us. Jon, it's good to have you joining us today. Thank you.
Hey, good to see you again, Bobby.
Well, I tell you what, we want to jump into this and try to identify some of the things that are of most critical issues and values. Let's kind of zone in to start with right on the SBC 23 meeting. And why don't you give us kind of an overview to start with? What did you see as some of the most significant resolutions and motions that came out of the SBC 23 annual meeting?
Yeah, sure. Of course, one of the blessings of being in the Southern Baptist family is there are so many important issues. It's hard to say if it made the floor that it wasn't important. But obviously, we've got things media has focused on the role of women in ministry in the Saddleback Church. That's been a big point of discussion and important to our family. Sex abuse and the Baptist response to that has been important. We passed resolutions on things like immigration, women in ministry, artificial intelligence. That was one that was in there new this year. So lots of important things everywhere you look, in addition to great reports from many Baptist ministries about the work they're doing around the world. So it's important to be in the room to understand the scope of everything that's going on.
Yeah, and actually in the room this year was a pretty strong turnout compared to some of the recent years as far as total registration, total number of people that were actually there, including guests. So had a fairly good attendance. Being in New Orleans in the Deep South, that probably had a lot to do with that as well. I'd like to come back maybe later if we have enough time and let you kind of help for us understand a little bit more about the process that the convention goes through at that parliamentary level. Most churches don't deal with parliamentary procedure much more than motion, second, and vote in the local church. But in a convention, a huge gathering, you have to follow parliamentary procedure. And you have been on the platform, not only in Missouri, but also for the Southern Baptist Convention in the past. But let's not jump into that barrel right now. But maybe you can help us understand how some of that is weeded out through the process. But let's jump in first on some of these motions and resolutions. There was a resolution, or no, was a resolution? Yeah, I put motion there. It's not motion. It's actually a resolution that was passed on artificial intelligence. Why would that be something of significance for a group like the Southern Baptists to have addressed?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think artificial intelligence, there's an element of buzz and hype. And I think you'll find some naysayers that say it's not as smart as it looks. But in the past couple of years, we've had some revolutionary advances, at least in statistics, that can make computers spit out kind of essays and responses that look as good as the average human, or even sometimes better, sometimes a well-educated response to what appear to be simple questions. And so our theorists and theologians have talked about what happens if we have an intelligence that's smarter than humans, and where should we go from there. And they've raised concerns about that. And I think that's all off way in the future. I do think an important question for theologians, and thankfully Southern Baptists have begun to think about these issues, is what is the moral operating system behind these languages and these systems. If we can ask the computer for answers and it can give us answers, what is the standard by which we judge whether or not it's a good answer? And so folks have already asked it political questions, systems like ChatGPT from the OpenAI group. If you ask it political questions, it tends to hem and haw about conservative responses. It gives you straightforward answers about liberal questions. And so already you can see politically the makers can put in a slant. And so the question is, how should people of faith, how should Christians, how should Baptists think about those systems? I know one thinker, Kevin Kelley, has said he's tongue-in-cheek began working on a catechism for robots. How is it you explain the spiritual world, the moral world to the robots? And frankly, that's going to be an important question. What is the moral operating system we tell computers to follow? And what is the system we follow back towards computers? Those are angels on head of pen thoughts. Those are big thoughts, but somebody does need to think about them so that we're not ruled by the robots. We rule over them.
Well, let me ask you one more question legally with the AI, then let's move on to something else. But I know I'm a transitional pastor right now in a church, and I've used ChatGPT in working on sermons. Now, before everybody freaks out totally, I didn't have it write my sermons, but at times I have very difficult time with proper grammar.
Yeah, and I think that's perfectly acceptable. I've used ChatGPT. I've given it passages out of my own briefs and said, check this for grammar or check this for
sentence structure, and actually a couple of weeks ago I was doing a series, a couple of messages on basically understanding kind of the demographics in your area, kind of a thing. I won't go into detail, but I was looking for a good illustration to talk about the collapse of America, the culture, the morals, all that kind of thing. And so I went in ChatGPT and I said, tell me all of the cultural I can't remember exactly how I worded it, cultural issues and something else related to the fall of the Roman Empire. I mean, that's a huge deal, right? And historically, we know about that. And it gave me a really good paragraph about all these things that were contributors. So I went in and took out the words Roman Empire and rewrote that phrase into my opening illustration. And I said, folks, I want you to tell me who this sounds like as I describe this illustration of a nation.
Right.
And I read that off and it was all of Rome. And so I got to the end and I asked, I said, who does that sound like? And everybody said, well, that sounds like the America, US. And I had one historian that said, sounds like the Roman Empire. Oh yeah. Always got to be somebody. but I said, yeah, that's the Roman Empire. And we know what happened, the collapse of the empire and everything else. And so I would have never come up with that kind of an illustration were it not for that kind of a tool. So if you use it correctly, it's a great thing. What are the legal implications, though, for like seminaries, research papers, all these other things, and not just ChatGPT? There are a number of different bots now that can do this kind of thing. What does the church need to be alert to, and our convention as a whole? And let's jump into a couple of other things.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one big concern the lawyers have been talking about this week that might play over into your example right there is ChatGPT uses statistics to give a kind of what the average person might give, so what the average response might look like. It doesn't really know the facts, and it will make up facts. And so there's probably enough about the Roman Empire out there that the average response is historically correct. But lawyers have been trading examples of a case out of New York here a few weeks ago where a lawyer asked ChatGPT to find it some cases on a certain point, and ChatGPT made the cases up. They don't exist. Wow. And then it asked him, the lawyers asked them, well, can you give me the text of that case? And it made that up. And then they said, I can't, the lawyers tried to find it elsewhere, couldn't find it. And they said, are you sure these are real cases? Because we can't find them in the database. And ChatGPT said, yes, we're sure it's real. It's a real case. And so they turned in that brief to the judge, and the judge couldn't find the cases either. And so they are in extreme hot water, having given the judge fake cases and then promised the judge they are real, and then said, because ChatGPT told us so. But it had all been made up. So ChatGPT does not know the facts. It's good at giving you the averages, but it's not good at giving you unique facts. So beware of that. Obviously, there are concerns about plagiarism and style. If I say, I give it my speech and say I need this to be written so that it sounds more like J.D. Greer, it'll do it. So we need to be careful about using the machines to both misappropriate from other people. That's possible. Or to mimic style, or to pass off thoughts that are not our own. as others. So certainly I wouldn't use it for major research papers. Grammar checking
and the
fine.
same with messages, sermons, Bible studies.
Sermons,
You're doing that kind of thing. Yeah, sure.
anything somebody
Well,
expects to be your own work, you shouldn't be passing off.
exactly. Well, and the one major thing you just brought out with artificial intelligence right now, especially with ChatGPT, to me, the major weakness is, even if I were using it for research of something, I want to know what the sources are. And it does not identify those sources. And in that case, you just stated, it said these are sources, and they weren't actually sources. So, yeah. Okay, let's jump into another thing. One of the other issues at the Southern Baptist Convention annual meeting this year, I felt for another year, there was an overarching kind of a sense from the messengers for a desire for financial transparency. And we've seen that over the last few years, and we've seen motions be brought to the floor. We've seen things try to get through the process to the platform, and then let me use the term through the platform to be able to get on back onto the floor to be voted on. And that just hasn't happened again, it seems like. So talk to us a little bit about what you see as some of the dynamics of the fiscal transparency, and then we in our conversation as well.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, for the past several years, messengers, me among them, have tried to make motions that will result in greater financial transparency to SBC churches as they give money. And so I think some folks will debate whether or not there's reason to have concern there. I think certainly there is, ranging from our largest entity, the North American Mission Board, down to even our smallest entity. I'm on the board at the RLC, so I have an insight there. But folks, I think, have good reason to ask, do we have appropriate insight into our finances so that the convention can hold trustees responsible? And then this last year with the financial disclosures at Southwestern Seminary, about a what in essence looks to me to be an admission of 25 years of mismanagement by trustees. I think the convention is right to ask, are we getting enough information to know there's a problem, or are we just getting enough information to put us to sleep? And then they tell us there's a problem only after the fact. Are we getting enough up front? And part of the problem is the convention's financial disclosure rules, in my view, are outdated. They were probably advanced for their time. We have a business and financial report document that requires each of the entities to provide audited financial statements, to get audited financial statements, and to provide a small portion of that to the public every year, to Baptists, in what we call the Book of Reports. So we'll get kind of these high overview numbers that talk about money in and money out. And that's more than you used to get for most religious charities. The IRS has required public charities to publish certain items for decades, but churches have traditionally been exempt. And the Southern Baptists started doing it, frankly, before the IRS required anything. The executive board was formed in 1917, but didn't really get a firm mission until 1927. And then right after it kind of was able to look into books. There was the famous case of the Carnes defalcation. Clinton S. Carnes was the treasurer of the Home Mission Board in Atlanta, or Alpharetta, and turns out he was a swindler and a crook, but came with a good reference. And so he'd been hired and was the treasurer for over a decade and lived high on the hog. Everybody knew it. But because he was paying off associates and paying off friends with money, no one ever came to the floor to question his high-flying lifestyle. And then he walked off in 1928 and tried to abscond. And then the auditors swooped in and found that he'd stolen over $1 million over the course of his term. So that sparked Baptists in the 20s and 30s to demand additional disclosures, and they got more than most folks got. But in today's world, after 70 years, we're now behind. Baptists have less confident reporting, narrow reporting than the average charity. So the average charity that's not a church charity has to file what is called IRS Form 990.
Okay, let me interrupt you just a second. Let's backtrack just a little bit.
Yeah.
As this has progressed, we have gotten better transparency over a period of years. And just a point of correction real quick, not Alpharetta when the Home Mission Board, it was actually Spring Street, downtown Atlanta.
It was downtown Atlanta, that's right.
Yeah, it was downtown Atlanta. But because of all the changes that have happened in society and with charitable organizations, the IRS now requires that they report every year certain things. So to track the history real fast, a couple of years ago, some of this started really surfacing in the annual meeting after the McRaney and NAMM debate basically started about not being able to find out how NAMM was using money. Huge amounts of money, more money being used for church planting, a lot of other things being earmarked, but no itemization at all, just huge categories reporting. And so charities have to report on the Form 990, and that wasn't really addressed in the previous years. But here's the fact of the matter. Planned Parenthood, who is considered a charity, they reveal more information to their financial donors than what we get from our North American Mission Board or other entities at this point. Significantly more. So you can go online and you can find a 990 form that shows this information for Planned Parenthood or any other charitable organization at this point. So talk to us a little bit about why this year at the annual meeting, the approach was not just we want transparency and motions made to that effect in terms of we don't just want financial transparency, we want at least this level. Tell us why the 990 form is a model that is being approached now.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, there was a group called Reform NAMM Now that started a website that started publishing NAMM and asked questions. Why does NAMM own so much property? Is it really, it appears to own houses in areas that aren't serviced by church planters. It suddenly has a huge loan portfolio. It has now spun off its disaster relief effort into a ministry called Send Relief. But Send Relief, we don't know who's on the board. We don't know who controls it. We don't know any separate financials. So NAMM is so big, its budget is so large, you can hide a lot of financial detail in the basic reporting. So
let me interrupt you a second. When you talk about Send Relief, another one of the big fiscal issues related to that, not only what you just said, but they actually, NAMM, North American Mission Board, has been lobbying to get money from the government to be able to use for Send Relief, which was never done before. And our business and financial plan of the SBC, which dictates what can and cannot be done by our entities, they're not supposed to be raising money outside of the cooperative program without getting prior permission. And my understanding is none of that's been done. So there are several things, but we can't, I say we, meaning Southern Baptist, not me personally, but we haven't been able to get any kind of accountability at all about things like that's been happening with the financial transparency of Send Relief, NAMM, or these other organizations.
Yeah, and certainly one of the concerns with kind of these subsidiary groups in Missouri and in Georgia, when we had breakaway entities in both of those states that wanted to leave, one of the ways they tried to do that was to form these separate corporations and really put all the money and assets, anything valuable, over in the subsidiary, and then say, well, convention, you're left with to control this empty shell. Those trustees don't do anything. The real action comes in these subsidiaries. So Missouri has gone through a lot of pain and suffering and is very explicit about what's required of subsidiary corporations, that the convention has to name its board and control it just like it controls the entity itself. The SBC's business and financial plan probably should be read that way, but apparently people don't read it that way. And so we have, in several cases, whether it's foundations, I noticed just recently, Southwestern Seminary doesn't own its land. All of its land and property is owned by a separate development corporation. And so, I assume that's the same board, but who knows? And then we have Send Relief, and we don't know what government contracts it has, if any, who its board is, what its financials look like. So just the budgets have gotten so big, and the questions have gotten in some ways bigger. So I think folks like Reform NAMM Now 2 or 3 years ago started appealing to the trustees. Maybe if we just show it to the trustees, they'll see the problem and give us more information, and that got shot down.
So what does the 990 do then? Tell us, what does the Form 990 do?
Yeah, so the Form 990 is the IRS's current form that all nonprofits have to file unless they are part of a church or a integrated auxiliary of a church. So that results in kind of a strange deal that, in fact, Baptist seminaries, lots of Baptist seminaries that aren't SBC file a 990 form. The 990 goes through and requires some detailed analysis of income and expense, especially in terms of what are you spending on program versus what are you spending on salaries versus what are you spending on administration. And then for the top 5 salaries, it requires you to list the salary and benefits that end up with kind of the W-2 number for that person. So you get a peek at what the top 5 salaries look like in that organization. So, for example, I pulled up Mid-America Theological Seminary, pulled up their 990. They're not an SBC seminary officially, although lots of SBC folks have sought training from there because of its association with Adrian Rogers. And I can scroll down, and I know that Dr. Spradlin is the president there, and it lists his total compensation in 2021 as $226,988. That's been open. It lists the next 4 or 5 folks at that entity, what their compensation is and what their additional benefits might be. And then it requires fairly detailed accounting compared to what Baptists receive now about where that money went, how it's held, how much was in contributions and grants, how much of that was in program service, where it's invested, items like that. So it's what the IRS considers the public should know to make good decisions about giving.
Okay, so along that line, then, why should the SBC do this? I mean, you just gave the illustration of Mid-America Seminary, not one of ours, but they file a 990. Our seminaries do not, nor do any of our other entities. So why should the SBC move forward with this particular thing as was presented in this motion that actually didn't move forward?
Yeah, I think the number one reason is we're behind. Right.
Okay.
What we want these entities to be available. It's not just Baptists that give to Lottie Moon. It's not just Baptists that give to Annie Armstrong. The Baptist brand has been, we can assure you that we don't take administration costs off the top. People are not living high on the hog. Your money goes to where we'll say it goes. But in the last 4 or 5 years, we've had serious questions raised about, is it going there?
Right.
If you give your money to Southwestern Seminary, is it going to students or is it going to espresso machines that students never see? If you raise money and you send it to NAMM, is it going to NAMM or is it going to buy a house, like a condo in Chicago, for big name preachers to use for their staff? So those are questions about where the money goes. And so the question is, are Baptists getting even the bare minimum? This is a democratic organization. It lives on trust. And so are we opening the books enough, even compared to the world, that you can trust the money is going where we say it'll go? And the answer right now is no. We're behind the rest of the world in what needs to happen.
Okay, so why haven't those kinds of motions, when they came to the floor, like in 23 and our previous conventions, we've seen financial transparency, why have they failed? Why have they not been able to get through? And this, like I said, the overarching theme kind of in the last couple of years has really been transparency, is what you hear coming from the floor of the convention. But we're not getting those through the channels. Once it hits the platform, comes back, it's being thrown out or sent somewhere else where it's sent to die, it seems like. So why are we not being able to accomplish that?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, there's kind of a built-in resistance. We're good folks, they think, and why we're doing good with the money. Why should we have to go over and above what we're doing now Can't you trust us? And likewise, there's a lot of money that's spread around the Southern Baptist Convention. There's lots, over and above socks and backpacks. There's lots of grants and goodies and benefits. And so just like Clinton Carnes managed to evade detection for over a decade, there's lots of incentives for people that are the closer you get to the platform, the more it's assumed that you'll protect against disclosure or the angry deacon. I saw somebody say, well, nobody wants an angry deacon to come in and demand the financial secretary give them the results. And so it's easy to play off the people that say we need more disclosure as the angry deacon or the angry member, that they want to pry into our business and make life harder and stir up controversy about our giving. But in fact, it's the opposite. When there has been controversy, it is disclosure that cools things down. No one has complained about Mid-America Seminary salaries, frankly. If you polled Baptists, some of them might think that's too high, some might think it's too low, but it's open what they've decided is the right amount of compensation for their executives. And there's no controversy every year at their board meeting about it being too high or too low. The board has done it. So I think for Southern Baptists, it would lower the temperature of these questions. Are they living high on the hog is an eternal Baptist question. And I agree. Some people will ask that even when it's clear the number is right. But when you can't even get the number, and the trustees seem to be reluctant to open the doors and let sunshine in. And then the motion last year that I made, or Pastor Kim made, and I spoke in favor of, we were told that legal precedent meant we couldn't even get a committee to study one of our entities if they were spending poorly. And so last year, they wouldn't even let the motion be uttered. We said, can we appeal to the chair? No, the lawyers have told us that this motion cannot be considered. And I think that's bogus. But that was their position, was that they were not even going to let the words be uttered. This year, the motion is framed as an amendment to the business financial plan, which is controlled by the messengers. It did get referred automatically. I stood up and asked that it not be referred, that it be considered at this meeting.
Right.
And we had over half the room, by my estimation, like over half the room wanted to go ahead and adopt the standard the rest of the world follows. But there were 2 990 motions on the floor this year. And so I think that probably made some people nervous. You had to have 2/3 to avoid referral. So we had more than half. We didn't have 2/3. So both of those motions will get referred back to the executive committee, and they'll have to respond somehow next year. But we'll see what they recommend. I'm hopeful. I'm sure we'll send some folks down to speak in favor of it with the executive committee. And with enough pressure or enough people speaking up, I hope the executive committee will see why this is a good transparency move, why this is helpful not just to them, but to all of our donors and all of our churches. But it may be that messengers need to take it up next year and do some floor magic. And if that's what it needs, we'll think about that closer to next year in Indianapolis.
Okay. Well, real quickly, address this. When you and I were talking prior to our conversation today, this was an issue came up. Would it require exposing missionaries or operations in sensitive areas to file this kind of sensitive information or this kind of information, like it's on the 990? And then I want to take a couple of questions from our viewers.
Yeah. So I actually heard this from a missionary friend that came up to me afterwards and said, I'm headed off to a sensitive area. Would this reveal me or my location? And I've heard others have said they've heard that same concern. The answer to that is no, unless you're one of the top 5 employees. It's my understanding that wouldn't be the case, that you would not, you wouldn't have the folks in an undisclosed location in Asia or a hostile country. You wouldn't have to disclose them. Now, that being said, if that were ever a concern, I think that's certainly something the executive committee could address in this off year. I want to make clear that the motion that I drafted, that Rhett Burns made, and that I'd spoken in favor of, doesn't require anybody to actually file anything with the government. I don't want to address the church state concerns. I think it's right that they don't make you file. And I don't think Baptists should have to turn over anything to the government. I do think that the public disclosure part, that's what I want Baptists to have. So there's no requirement that you send the government any secret information. If there is a legitimate concern about confidential areas, I'm happy to receive that qualification in whatever is ultimately adopted. It shouldn't normally require disclosure of individuals, again, unless they were in the top 5. And I don't think that's the case at IMB. And then the only other place it requires disclosure of information about international efforts, it just requires disclosure by region. So Asia or by continent, kind of like we all talk about it already. So I don't think it would require any new disclosure that would endanger what people think is our good mission.
Any of our missionaries. Okay, let's take a couple of questions that have popped up in comments. First, Violet for Victorian Babes ask, is it the policy to make motions available to messengers 10 days before the meeting? If yes, did it happen at this convention?
No, but so the messengers get to make motions, and motions can be about anything. The SBC has divided our motions into 2 categories. One we just call motions. That's miscellaneous business. The other, if we have an opinion about something, is called a resolution in SBC life. And in the rest of the corporate world, resolutions and motions mean about the same thing. But in SBC life, they mean something different. So in the SBC world, if you're going to direct an entity, that's called a motion. It's during miscellaneous business. Any messenger can make one, and there's no advance notice. So you have to, in order to know what's going to happen, you have to show up at the meeting and you vote on those. If it expresses the opinion of the SBC about some issue, the SBC has decided those need special study. And so those have been called resolutions, and those have traditionally been sent to a resolutions committee. So if you stand up at the microphone and say, I'd like to put us on record against the Elvis stamp. I remember one year that was a big deal. We wanted to be against the Elvis stamp. How dare they put Elvis on a stamp? Well, that's in the formative opinion. So that's a resolution, and that has to go through the resolutions committee. And the current process is, if you want to make a resolution, you have to pre-submit it, and the committee gets to look at it and decide if it wants to adopt your resolution or not. And then there's a process by which, if they decline it, you can pull it out of the grave and have the convention consider it, and that can happen.
Okay, so but
the new bylaw, we adopted a new rule this year that now says the resolutions committee now should give us what they expect to present at the convention 10 or 15 days in advance. I can't remember the number, but I think it is 10 days.
Right.
So at next year's convention, we're supposed to get an initial report of resolutions so we know what we're going to vote on before we get there. Because even this year, you show up at the convention, they hand you a bulletin, it's got 8 pages of resolutions. And if you're distracted by resolution number 8, they may pass resolution number 3 before you've had a chance to digest it. So that's a good step forward on bylaws or on resolutions. We should get that next year about advance notice. But otherwise, motions, you don't get advance notice unless somebody tells you they plan to bring something.
Okay, there are significant things that are facing us legally as far as the Southern Baptist Convention as well. One of the things that's been kind of bouncing around in the background for most people, but in the foreground for others, is the McRaney versus NAMM lawsuit. That has now had a trial date. It's been moved to September 18th, the week of September 18th, later this fall. What are your observations about that? And we need to do this briefly because we're through about a third of the questions and we're over half the time past.
Yeah, sure.
but what do you see as the ramifications of what may come out of this within that lawsuit, and the things we have seen that have happened at the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court, things happened with SCOTUS, and how that could impact not only the SBC but the local church?
Yeah, so the real core question about in NAMM versus McRaney is how much authority can NAMM have? How much protection is there for NAMM to reach out to other Baptist entities that are independent and autonomous and kind of flex and use its power to control political outcomes. So Brother McRaney says NAMM reached out while he was the executive director at the Maryland Delaware convention, and got him fired because he was trying to negotiate a better deal for that convention with NAMM's shared funds. Those are separate Baptist bodies, but NAMM's argument has been, well, we're all under the same Baptist family, and so we've got a First Amendment right to go out and talk with that convention. Whereas McRaney's lawyers have argued fairly strongly that this is not a religious dispute between members of, it's not the same organization, but the things that NAMM accused McRaney of doing were not religious misdeeds, but contractual, scientifically determinable items that the judge doesn't need to get into a religious dispute about. So that'll be interesting to watch. I think the question for the judge is this a religious dispute, or is this a business dispute that involves two religious groups? Is it something a judge can touch or not? That will be key to this. If the judge decides there's a business core to it, kind of like the same question that's concerning McLean Bible Church and David Platt's church in Virginia. Very similar issues. You have religious people in a dispute, and the question is it a religious dispute? Because if it's that, the judge can't hear it. But if it's a business dispute or a determinable dispute, then the courts might offer some relief.
So that's just
important.
Let's jump ahead real fast, because the court several times have ruled against NAMM trying to play the card that this is a religious dispute rather than between two entities and the organizations, and then having come after McRaney, actually, after he left the Baptist Convention of Maryland, Delaware. And the concerns the average, Joe Baptist has are what a pastor called me maybe 10 days ago. And his primary question was, I have people in my church that are concerned that if the things that North American Mission Board has said to these courts, using the terms of hierarchy, organizational authority, these kinds of things, the way they position themselves, if those start being drawn together, are we going to be liable in our local church if some church over in Nashville or Portland or somewhere else gets sued for sexual abuse of a pastor or something? Are we going to be held liable because we're all getting connected like this? And I think that's a huge concern for a lot of these churches across our convention. Do we even want to stay connected? Because the executive committee, spent half of their money almost this last year with the sexual abuse issues and some of those kind of things. So it's like, how is this going to possibly impede us as a local church? Can you address that quickly, and then let's move on?
Well, and so those items overlap, because frankly, some of the stuff that happened in McRaney and NAMM's use of hierarchical principles and analogies to the Catholic Church that were filed, and then in some cases people stepped back from them later, that came at the exact same time there is the hue and cry about abuse in the Southern Baptist Convention, and advocates for abuse victims. It's their job, and they're going to do their job, and they're going to argue that the Southern Baptist Convention really is one big pool of money. That all of these entities and the various levels of autonomy and all that is smoke and mirrors, and they're going to try to show that there really are a few guys at the top and they control everything. And so when the court comes time to award damages, and the damages are billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars, and one of our entities, the executive committee, for example, the executive committee will run out of money pretty fast if there's $1 billion judgment. And the job of the lawyers for victims is to say, no, we can go over to the seminaries or to NAMM or to IMB, or if we need to, down to state conventions, or if we need to, down to the big churches, because frankly, big churches and their pastors run this whole enterprise. So they're going to try to draw these lines that make the whole thing one big pile of money, because they expect to get damage awards that are bigger than maybe any one entity can pay. And so it was really the worst possible time for NAMM to make kind of overstatements about its relationship and control down to the state convention level or to the church level. Whereas you said McRaney says they've interfered with his ability to get even speaking gigs at churches because those churches don't want to get on the wrong side of NAMM. And that starts to look a lot like an enterprise that is controlled from Alpharetta or from Nashville and not the autonomous Baptist church system that all of us have heard described for many years. So the combination of NAMM and McRaney and the arguments in sex abuse, those are probably the legal issues we didn't talk about at the convention that are still out there. They're going to have to be answered that may affect the Southern Baptist system and what churches are able to do in the future.
Well, I want to talk about the law amendment, which was presented, what you have termed as the Bart Barber James Merritt Cooperative Task Force. And we're going to talk about some of the legal dangers that we see facing the SBC with the Sexual Abuse Task Force moving forward and some of those things. But first, let's address the two really significant documents that the SBC has. And these are supposed to be guiding what we're doing. And that is the Constitution and bylaws of the convention, and the bylaws dictating how everything operates in our entities, and then the business and financial plan. Both of these are very significant documents, and the accusations have been, and actually the documented evidence has been, that particularly North American Mission Board, but others possibly too, have not been abiding by those, and like they get a pass at some time. So what are the legal issues facing our convention as a whole if we have entities that are, I'll just say, kind of running amok and not following what's in our papers? That's what lawyers always tell me. Well, if we end up in court, we're going to go look at the paper, not what you told me or your handshake. We're going to look at the paper. So what are we facing legally if this continues to happen?
Yeah, so it is both a political and theological and legal mess when churches or religious groups don't follow their governing documents.
Okay.
Whatever you do, you should write it down and follow it. And we do have a Baptist system right now where there's a constitution and bylaws, and most churches will have something like that. And then we have this business and financial plan document that is the executive committee's ability to oversee the other entities. Right. And there's always been this tension between the executive committee acting for the convention ad interim, having the responsibility to think about the whole during the year, and the entities wanting them to get off their backs. You know, the entities say, we're independent, we got our own trustees. And so we are at a kind of there's ebb and flow when the convention wants the executive committee to take an active role, and when the convention wants the executive committee to step back. And we have hit recently kind of the lowest possible point for the executive committee oversight, and we're noticing things falling apart. So when the sex abuse motion passed, I am in some ways cynical about the sources of that motion. I understand there's victims and concerns that have been raised, but a lot of that seemed to me to be calculated to push the executive committee to get off the backs of the entities. Lots of the supporters, you will note, were frustrated with what the executive committee was doing. And the same at Southwestern Seminary. They were upset with the executive committee for being too close to Paige Patterson, they said, but also for asking too many questions. Right. And NAMM, likewise, seemed to support some abuse reform. They were tired of the executive committee asking questions. So as a result of the fear and anger sparked by the sex abuse investigation, where the accusation was made, the executive committee's lying to you, hiding things from you. Messengers went through the extraordinary step of imposing this outside investigation on them. The investigation reveals what President Barber says in depositions. It revealed we didn't call some people back on time, and we kept a list. A lawyer kept a list of already disclosed abuse accusations, convictions that they didn't republish. Two fairly minor.
Let me stop you just a second, because I love the way you phrase that. Already disclosed list. So many people have said, well, this is some secret list. But it wasn't. These were all things that were already disclosed. And Augie Bodo, the attorney at the SBC Executive Committee, he just kept a file These
Right.
things that came publicly, he just kept a file to be aware of in case he needed to go back and reference it. So it wasn't like he was compiling some kind of secretive list so they could move pastors around.
Yeah, no,
At that point.
There was no off the record abuse allegations there. These were stuff that had already been reported in the public, that if they were asked to give a statement about, they would have kind of an idea of what was going on.
Right. Well, all of this has kind of set the climate now for in the 23 annual meeting this year in June. We saw some recommendations, some motions coming about changing SBC documents. Address that real quickly, and why is that important?
Yeah. So, like I said, the recent trend has been to depress the executive committee's ability to go out and engage in oversight. The other entities don't like questions. They don't like disclosure. They want to get on with their program without what they view as the hassle of that oversight. So there have been motions to amend the governing documents the last couple of years. One of them was the law amendment. One of them was to discuss what does it mean to be, or can you be a member of a Southern Baptist church? The Constitution says the convention is composed of messengers from churches, and the churches are in friendly cooperation with the convention statement of faith, the Baptist Faith and Message 2000. So we've always had, we've had for decades now, a Baptist Faith and Message statement of faith. And we've held convention entities to that standard, but we've allowed a little wiggle room with local churches. We'll cash your check and we'll let you send messengers if you are closely aligned or in friendly cooperation with our program. And generally, Baptists have not been too anxious to dig up new reasons to not cash your check. We are not responsible for each other traditionally, and so the attitude has always been, if you want to give money to Lottie Moon and let Baptists control it, then you're welcome to send your messengers. And if you have a wild hair idea about open communion or something else, then you'll get outvoted, but we'll still cash your check and treat you like family. But about 20 years ago, with the advent of the internet, and it kind of gets easier to discover these things, the convention got concerned about churches that were ordaining homosexuals to the ministry.
Right.
And at that point, the executive committee said, oops, we have found a way that you could use the Baptist name to trash the Baptist name. When you go out and tell the world you're hiring or ordaining people that are engaged in homosexuality, it causes a scandal. The media shows up. It shows up in the newspapers. And so that undermines the Baptist faith and message, the Baptist message to the world enough. We're not even going to cash your check anymore. If you do that, you're out.
And it's what Baptists call disfellowshipping.
Right.
So they choose just not to well, and just to clarify, Southern Baptists are not a denomination like many people. You hear that term used frequently. It's a cooperative effort. So it's a convention of cooperating churches. So that's why the term is used, disfellowship. It's not necessarily kick out the same,
right?
Because it's not a denominational structure coming from the top down. And so they disfellowship, say, look, we're just not on the same page anymore. We're not of like faith and order is the phrase that's frequently used. So all of this, and you alluded to this a minute ago, the law amendment. Talk to us about the impact of the law amendment and why that was significant in this year's convention.
Yeah, so like you just said, we have a theology of cooperation, and it's pretty transactional. The Baptist Faith and Message has an article on cooperation. Everyone should go read it. And it says, whatever is the most efficient means to accomplish the will or the ends of the kingdom, that's how Baptists should organize. And so when somebody is excluded from a Baptist organization like the Southern Baptist Convention, it's not church discipline. It's just saying, we've decided that you leaving the group would be more expedient, frankly. It's super transactional is our stated theology about this. So I think some people want to think of it as like we've excommunicated churches or sentenced them to purgatory or whatever. That's Catholic. That's not the way the Baptists work. We've just said it would be expedient for us to not be cooperating in this group at this time. There might be ways we could cooperate on other things, I'm sure. If there's local good government effort, we're happy to cooperate with Methodists and CBF folks. But in terms of a missions program to reach the world and seminary education, if you're too far away from the Baptist faith and message, it's no longer expedient. You are undermining our message. So, Mike Law, oh, you're muted there, Bobby.
That's what happens when you accidentally mute. I was trying to interrupt and I couldn't. See what good was that? And for many viewers, I'm sure they'd prefer I stay muted. But anyway, talk to us about the impact of the law amendment. Now, from what you just said, as you set that context up, why is this so significant this year, where other things have not passed in the recent past?
So I think Mike Law last year at the convention, you'll remember in Anaheim, there was a debate over Saddleback. Somebody reported Saddleback Church, and the Credentials Committee said, well, we're not really sure what pastor means even, and we're not sure Saddleback is appointed a woman pastor. And the convention said, no, we're not going to spend a year studying that. And then the Credentials Committee withdrew their motion to disfellowship Saddleback. Well, Mike Law at the same convention made a motion to go ahead and amend the Constitution, just like the Executive Committee had recommended 20 years ago, to add, well, you can't ordain homosexuals or affirm homosexuality and still be in cooperation. And then 3 years ago, we'd added 2 more provisions that said, if you're a racist, if you engage in race discrimination unrepentantly, then that also undermines our message. And if you mishandle abuse in certain ways, you can undermine the Baptist message. And so Mike Law came along and said, let's add another statement, just like we have before, that says another step out of bounds is to hire, appoint, or affirm a woman as a pastor of any kind, the title pastor, or to give them a pastor-like role. And so Mike made that motion, and the Executive Committee really tied themselves in knots all year long about that. I think Mike Law and most Baptists see that as a minor step in the same direction, that you can be so out of step with the Baptist message on gender and sexuality and anthropology, that if you say we've got a pastor over here and they're a great person, they've just been born in the body of a woman, but we'd still like to make them pastor. Well, that explanation in the current climate undermines what Baptists intend to communicate about gender and sexuality so much that Baptists say, we'd rather not make you a messenger. We'll have to say you're outside the family. We'll have to find other ways to cooperate. We'll probably buy your books, buy the caseload, but we can't say that you are within the Baptist family on this issue, and so we're going to have to exclude you. That's what I think supporters of the amendment mostly understood. There's a narrow group of folks, especially in management, that have said, oh my goodness, the sky is about to fall, because if Baptists start enforcing that Baptist faith and message, there's not enough true believers to run this thing. I think they are afraid that most Baptists run churches that disagree with some way with the Baptist faith and message. And so there's been this scramble to find some new principle that could limit the convention's ability to add new sections to this bylaw. And that's what I think is behind the what I've called the Merritt Barber task force. There was a new task force appointed to study the parameters of cooperation, a super generic charge. The president gets to appoint the committee, but everyone that seems to be in the know says it's an alternative to the law amendment, or it will cure the concerns of the law amendment while still being winsome. I don't know what any of that means. I don't think there's a better solution than the one we have, because frankly, I don't think Baptists intend to run headlong into a purity spiral and disfellowship everybody right and left. I think Baptists are pretty pragmatic and like a big tent, and they like big support as long as it's Baptist. And so we'll put up with, frankly, lots of different opinions on these topics. But it's not a small difference in this culture, given the arguments that are being made, to adopt a woman in the role of the pastorate. That's not a small step. So people raise questions about, well, what about open communion? I don't think that's a live issue in this culture, that Baptists need to divide over open communion. I don't think they'll go hunting for that. It just, in the same way, whenever you use a 3-leaf clover analogy, that's technically a heresy. But I don't see Baptists getting up in arms in this culture, going after every preacher that used a 3-leaf clover illustration, because it's not about whether or not it violates the Baptist faith and message. I think that's important, and the convention could, in theory, enforce it that way. What I think Baptists are saying is you can't be so far out of line that it undermines our message. And so it's not just, is it a technical violation of the Baptist faith and message, but is it a material violation that undermines the message we're trying to communicate? That's what I think Baptists did. And the fear that this will result in a fundamentalist purity spiral and the fundamentalists will throw out everybody to their left. That's not what happened here. This was Baptists saying, we've always said, if you're out of line on sex and gender enough, we'll say, bless you, but we can't cooperate in missions with you. And this was a very minor extension of that principle in the law amendment. And I hope there's not an overreaction from management trying to nail down every which way people can get thrown out.
Right.
The convention needs to be flexible. And so things that aren't a big deal now could be a big deal in the future. And so we want to be clear about our theological ideals in the Baptist faith and message. We shouldn't water that down. We should carefully decide what specific things might put you so far out of step that it causes a scandal or undermines our message. But that's not just disagreement. There'll always be disagreement amongst Baptists. There will always be different opinions, even about things that we think are secondary issues.
Right.
But we shouldn't turn all of our secondary issues into tertiary issues. That's what I think some have said. And that's,
well, they're trying to kind of prevent a sliding slope. I mean, I think that's, some are concerned about it starting to spiral or something of that sort. So,
but defining Baptist issues into optional issues, that's just old-fashioned liberalism, and Baptists don't want that either. So I think I'm hopeful next year that whatever recommendations we get from this committee, Baptists will say, no, we want to be in charge. We have a good system already, and we shouldn't change that very much, no matter what the recommendations are.
Now, I want to wrap up with the legal issues surrounding the sex abuse task force and some of those recommendations. But first, address this motion real quickly. The motion that was made about trustee training prior to service. Is that needed? Why is it needed? If it is, what's the significance of having some kind of trustee training outside of just the entity doing its own training?
Yeah, it would be a great step. It's an important step. I've provided trustee training for Missouri Convention trustees here for the last few years. It's important that everyone gets on the same page and understands a little bit of the history. Unfortunately, too often the committees treat trusteeship as a good way to get introduced to Baptist life. And that's, in my experience, a bad way to introduce them. A good way to introduce them is an annual meeting, not putting them on a board. And so it's important that we all have the same unified goal. I will say, my experience is it's not enough to just tell them, do your best for the convention or do your best for the entity, because all of them think that if something bad happens, invariably we get lots of trustees that think, well, it'd be best if we just were quiet about this, if we let this slide. As we've seen at Southwestern, if a generation of trustees do that, then things become almost irretrievable. Southwestern is in serious shape, and it's not out of the woods yet, even with what I think is good new leadership. So we need to not just tell trustees that they need to do their best for the Southern Baptist Convention. We also need to take away the idea that they can hide the bad news. The bad news will get out. We are transparent enough in the Southern Baptist Convention, and we talk enough, and that's the reason we have big boards, is that we don't want there to be room to hide bad news. And so we want to know about the bad news. We want to manage the bad news. We want Baptists to be able to plan accordingly, but it helps nobody if everything is, all smiley faces until you find out it's dead. Right. Yes. Right. Yesterday, Southwestern was great, and now it's dead, and we're sorry to have to tell you it's dead. Well, somewhere in between there, the Baptists wanted to manage what was happening, And if the trustees don't give us the bad news, we can't manage, to turn things around.
Right. Can it work at all? Well, let's
Right.
wrap up with this. Address the legal dangers we see of the SBC sexual abuse response. What's been happening now over the last 12 plus months as we've seen this unfolding? What do you see as our legal issues?
Well, like we said, I think, unfortunately, like I said, I think, unfortunately, some folks were more angry about their political situation than they particularly cared about what was going on with abuse victims. And so they were willing to throw in and make promises. They didn't care if they could be handled or not, because they didn't expect they would have to honor them. They thought it was a convenient way to challenge the current executive committee and to accuse them of acting in bad faith and not responsive enough. And that's real easy to do until you're on the executive committee.
Right.
Unfortunately, a lot of the promises that were made early on by kind of the challengers during the sex abuse motions, those were the exact things you would want to do if you wanted to turn the SBC into one big pile of money for victims. Some people wanted to do that. I'm sure some lawyers wanted to do that. I think some people didn't care what happened. They thought they were on their way out of the SBC, and so they didn't care what happened to the SBC. Some people went along with it, not understanding what went along, what was happening. But the short-term effect has been, suddenly, it used to be all the money came into the SBC executive committee, and it made decisions and distributed the money to all the other entities. But very little happened at the Southern Baptist Convention level that could have resulted in liability or in group liability. So if you wanted to turn the thing into one big pile of money, you'd have to go up the chain to the SBC and then back down to the other entities. So if there were misconduct at Southeastern, you have to go prove the SBC knew about it and they controlled it. And then it went back down to, say, the executive committee or Southern, and then you tell the judge to treat that as one big pile of money. If you'll notice what's happened with sex abuse, everything has happened at the SBC level. And that destroys a lot of the arguments about the SBC corporation not being being independent from all the other entities.
Exactly.
So where's ARITF? At the SBC level. Where's SATF? At the SBC level. When the motions talk about who failed to train churches, who failed to train them? The SBC failed to train them. So suddenly the SBC corporation is taking on a lot of blame. And Baptists have for so long been fed this line about the SBC only exists 3 days a year, and the rest of the year the executive committee operates. I guess people believe that so hard, but the SBC is a Georgia corporation. It exists 365 days a year as a legal entity. And so we've got committees that operate all year, ARITF has operated all year. So the Southern Baptist Convention, Inc., a Georgia corporation, can accept liabilities and operate throughout the year. And I am worried that an under-discussed portion of what's happening is the defenses to independence, or all the claims of independent entities at the Southern Baptist Convention level. When the rush came in for the push for abuse reform, a lot of that was designed to make it one big pool of money for defendants, and that's their job for some of them. But for the folks that intend to run the Southern Baptist Convention, that's going to be a problem. And I think they've begun to realize it and realize that they've overpromised. And so I think what we're going to see over the next year are people that were in front of the abuse crisis response, wanted to be seen as doing something, are going to walk back slowly and say, well, we can't quite do that. You're already seeing that in the database. Well, we're going to have to think more about step 4 because that's awfully tricky.
Yeah, sure.
We haven't published, we had a list of 700. They're not in the database yet. We've got this very minimal database prototype that doesn't have any data in it yet. ARITF had 4 or 5 goals over this year, and as far as I could tell, they didn't accomplish any of them in the year. And now they've asked for more time, and there's not really deadlines on those. So once in power, they've found it much harder to live up to those promises they made when they were out of power. And I fear once the lawsuits start, and there are lawsuits brewing and bubbling out there, that it will be much, much easier to treat the SBC and all of its entities as one big pile of money, based on what's happened recently. And it remains to be seen how courts will treat that. But
Right.
The independence of the entities amongst themselves, that surely has been damaged by the way the convention has suddenly had the convention operating the abuse part of this at the very top of the pyramid.
Yeah. So realistically, the convention from the SBC national level or at a state or even association, providing resources, providing training, providing all those things, that doesn't connect you in the sense of liability. But the concern is if the SBC at the executive committee level begins to start paying out on lawsuits, et cetera, because of something happened in Kentucky or something happened in Miami or something, wherever, then all of a sudden we're all becoming responsible for what happened in another church somewhere else. And that they're kind of dictating this is what you have to do to not be liable.
Yeah.
At that point. And so good training is fine and resourcing is fine. But to me, it seems like we're putting the convention and our local churches in a difficult situation to where it appears that now we are connected and the SBC is trying to tell churches, this is what you must do. And again, back to the NAMM versus McRaney situation, if it's ruled on by the court that NAMM had the authority to use money to manipulate that situation of his employment, a number of other things that have been surfaced in that case, then that's saying that a national entity has authority over a state convention at that point. So there's several things here that kind of mesh together that could be of concern.
Right. Yeah. And last year we passed a resolution in Anaheim without much discussion that said we as the Southern Baptist Convention apologize for our failure to train churches and the harm it's caused. And that's, in a lawsuit, that's 2/3 of the way to a jury verdict, frankly. When you've alleged that you had a duty to train and you failed to carry out that duty, and that harmed somebody else. And so if you've got an abuse victim in a local church, and the church says, we would have caught this abuse if the Southern Baptist Convention had trained us earlier. Right. Well, then they're going to go straight to the Southern Baptist Convention Corporation. Whereas a year ago, most of us would have said, well, the SBC exists 3 days a year. They don't train anybody during that meeting. The executive board might have trained or Lifeway might have trained, but that wasn't the responsibility of the entire Southern Baptist Convention enterprise. But we passed a resolution that said that and didn't think about it or didn't get good legal advice about it. So we have said lots of things about our intention to train, but we, most students of Baptist Polity would have said, we couldn't make you take the training. We could have offered the training, but we couldn't guarantee it was the best. We could have offered our opinion. But we have run around accepting legal duties for the convention and saying we broke them. And in my experience, if you do that, then the jury will set the price of what that damage was. The convention won't get to decide what part of its budget goes to make up for that, make amends. That's what the jury will decide. So, as much as there are sex abuse issues that Baptists need to address, and I've been on record saying I think there can be a form of a message system or a database system that lets churches trade information. The way in which this has happened may severely handicap, like I've said, when you send money to Nashville, it going to where you expect it to go. Right. At some point, if you have legal duties and don't follow them, the courts will make you follow them, and the judges will decide where the money goes, not Baptists in the pews. And
that's not going to take but one case.
Yeah.
Once that happens one time, now you have a precedent on the book.
Well,
and it
I
potentially
think
opens a can of worms. Yeah.
Something to watch is certainly the Rollins versus Pressler case, where a young man alleges he was abused by Judge Pressler, and both a local church and the Southern Baptist Convention are included in that case, and they're going to argue the convention was responsible. And certainly if they ring the bell on damages there, that will be a key test of what the convention has admitted and whether or not it's responsible.
Yeah. Jon, thank you so much for taking the time. We talked about trying to stay within the hour, and we've gone over that. So I really appreciate the graciousness of your time and allowing us to do that. Can you wrap up for us by just kind of from a legal perspective, tell us just in closing thoughts, legally, what does that local church leader need to be really looking for? What do we really need to be aware of at the local church level?
Well, I think today, June 20, you need to make sure you give at least your $1 to the cooperative program or Annie or Lottie, so that you can show up next year in Indianapolis and make sure that transparency happens. The executive committee is going to receive a referral on the 990. And so whether they recommend it or not, there will be an attempt to have a vote on will Baptist entities meet the minimum standard required of every other worldly charity and most other institutions that we respect. So that will be an important issue. And then while you're there, you're also going to get to vote on the law amendment. Whether that it takes 2 votes for a constitutional amendment to occur, so that second vote will occur. And then we're going to get additional recommendations from the Merritt Barber Committee. And so if you care about transparency, if you care about a Southern Baptist Convention that is responsive to the needs of its churches and is flexible, and its governance is handled by the messengers, not by management, then it's important that you show up next year and cast your vote amongst those folks that join us in Indianapolis.
Yeah, very good. And I think those are good words for all of us to hear and try to put into practice. Jon, thank you again for joining us today. This has been so valuable. I know we could talk for a lot longer about any one of these given issues as we did, but I appreciate you joining us to help those who are concerned about the legal issues facing the Southern Baptist Convention. Well, with that, I'm Bobby Gilstrap, and we're glad you joined us today. I hope that you've already subscribed, liked, and shared this podcast today. If you'll do that, that always helps with the YouTube algorithm. All right. Thank you. And join us next time.
Thanks, Bobby.